Last time, we looked at Plato's arguments that human judgment and human knowledge requires the soul to be immortal, to make sense of the fact that we can make judgments at all about justice, about numbers, about geometrical facts. Today, we're going to look at the metaphysical arguments for the immortality of the soul. The first one of these arguments is called the argument from opposites. There's an easy way to misunderstand this argument. I hope you don't make it. The misunderstanding is that if something is big, it had to have once been small. If something is red, it had to have at one time been not red. That's not what Plato is arguing or assuming. He's not saying that everything that is a certain feature or property must have once been not that property. The argument from opposites concerns the word becomes or comes to be. It concerns the notion of change. The first premise of the argument is that if something comes to be smaller, then it has to have come to be smaller from once having been larger. The assumption really is that if something comes to be X from some kind of process, it had to come to be X from once having been the opposite of X. This means that only things that change into something else had to have once been the opposite. So if something has always been red, Plato is not saying that it had to once been not red. Instead, he's saying that anything that came to be red had to once been not red. Okay, so from the second premise, it follows by logic that if something comes to be dead, it has to come to be dead from once having lived. Similarly, if something comes to be living, it has to come to be living from the opposite of living, which Plato assumes is being dead. For things that come to be, the next premise is important. Plato is arguing in the Phaedo that there must be a cycle of becoming for anything that has become something else. Because if there was no cycle of becoming, everything would be alive or everything would be dead. If there wasn't an ongoing cycle of having something once been alive, having once been dead, then once something becomes alive, it would be always alive. And once something comes to be dead, it would always be dead. And eventually everything would be alive or dead without ever coming to be one or the other. So, since life must come to be from death, the soul attaching to the body must come from a soul detached from the body. As what it is to be a soul is to be the life-giving thing to a body. From this argument, the conclusion is that the soul must be immortal. And it's a very strange argument because Socrates seems to be overlooking two different kinds of change that things undergo. There are changes that preserve the identity of the object and changes that don't preserve it. What do I mean by that? Consider the example of having a bunch of macaroni that you turn into a sculpture. Let's say it's a macaroni sculpture of President Donald Trump. That thing, the sculpture of President Donald Trump, has a certain identity. It's a sculpture. You can do lots of things to it. You might paint the macaroni sculpture. It now comes to be red from having not been red. Painting it a color and then changing that color is a change that preserves the identity of the object. Painting their sculpture red does not make it no longer that sculpture. It makes it a red version of that sculpture. But there are other changes that don't preserve that identity. For instance, you have your macaroni sculpture of Donald Trump, and then you boil it and eat it. It goes through your digestive system, out the other end, and down the toilet. The sculpture of Donald Trump has now become poop in the sewer, and maybe down into the ocean. That's a change that has destroyed the identity of the object. We do sometimes talk this way. What happened to your sculpture of Donald Trump? It is now in the ocean. But that's actually not a change that's preserved the identity of the object. It's destroyed it. Why is this important for this argument? When Plato argues that if something comes to be living, it has to come to be living from once having been dead. One reading of that is that it's true. Living stuff comes from non-living stuff. But it doesn't mean that living berry lamb came from dead berry lamb, which becomes living berry lamb once again. Because the stuff that makes up living berry lamb isn't berry lamb. It might just be a bunch of calcium or iron or other material like that. Coming to be living from once having been dead might be a change that doesn't preserve the identity of the thing. Coming to be dead from once having been living maybe also doesn't preserve the identity. And that means that Plato can't argue that one and the same thing, Socrates or berry lamb, was once living and is now dead, only to become living again. Because that transformation, that becoming, might not preserve the identity of the object. Living and dying might not be like colors. Both Simmias and Cabes proceed to offer different objections to the argument for immortality. Simmias's objection assumes the same thing that Socrates assumes about the soul. It is invisible. It is responsible for knowledge. It attaches to the body to give it life. But Simmias claims that there are things in the world that have this feature too, and these things are not immortal. The example that Simmias gives is harmonies. Harmonies themselves are not visible, but they are in musical instruments. Yet, they can't survive the death of the musical instrument, destroy the ukulele, and the harmonies that are in the ukulele no longer exist. I'm not sure that I understand Simmias's objection. For instance, how is it that a harmony isn't visible? You can certainly hear a harmony when you have a musical instrument. Here's a ukulele. Let's use it as an example. Surely you can hear the difference between an in-tune ukulele and a not in-tune ukulele. This one's in tune. This is C. If it were not in tune, you can hear it. There's a not in tune ukulele. Here's what I think Simmias has in mind. A particular sound caused by the ukulele might be harmonious or in tune, or unharmonious or not in tune. Simmias isn't likening that to the soul. Rather, what's he likening to the soul is a ukulele's being in tune. This ukulele is now in tune. This ukulele now being in tune is not itself perceptible. Particular harmonies are perceptible, like C or A minor. But its being in tune is a state or a condition that the ukulele is in. Being in tune or being harmonious is what Simmias is likening to the soul. You cannot see or hear its being in tune. It's just the state that the ukulele is in. Similarly, having a soul that is alive is a state that a human being is in. You can see or hear the consequences of that state, but the state itself isn't visible. It's kind of like saying ultraviolet light isn't visible. You can see its effects. You can see its effects in suntans, skin cancer, or vitamin D. It can cause a white glow in a dark room. What you see is the white glow, not the ultraviolet light itself. Being in tune is a state that the ukulele is in. Having an alive soul is a state that your body is in. And the objection goes that given that this is what a harmony is, it can't survive the death of the instrument. This instrument's being in tune is a result of a certain relationship between the strings. It results from it being wood and having a sound resonance hole. It's the result of all of the bodily features that the ukulele has. Remove all of those bodily features and it is no longer in tune. The in-tunedness of this ukulele follows from the physical features. And so maybe the soul follows from a certain harmonious relationship in the body. If those relationships are no longer harmonious, then just like the ukulele, the soul disappears, just like the harmony of the ukulele disappears. That's the objection. Cabys' objection. Cabys' objection is that a cycle of becoming, even if the argument works, does not imply immortality. And Cabys has a point. A body can be to a soul like clothing is to a body. The fact that a body becomes something that wears blue and then becomes something that wears red does not imply that the body is immortal. And so the soul coming to be in a body and then coming to be not in a body doesn't imply that the soul is immortal either. Maybe the soul is one of these things that inhabits a body, leaves it, and then dies. Socrates has many responses to these arguments. I'm not going to go through all of them. The Phaedo is quite a long dialogue, and you should be studying it carefully to go through all of the arguments that you think are interesting in it. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these responses. First, to Simmias. The first response to Simmias takes for granted that the argument from recollection that we talked about in the first lecture is true. And so somehow we need to explain how the soul could have existed before it inhabited a body in order to make sense of mathematical knowledge and judgments. For a ukulele, the harmony cannot exist prior to the existence of the physical parts of it. It can only come into existence after the physical parts are existing and arranged in a certain way. Because the soul had to pre-exist the body to explain knowledge, we can dismiss that the soul is like the harmony. The second response is that there are degrees of harmoniousness for a ukulele, but no degrees of personhood for a human being. This is interesting. The idea is if something is disharmonious, it can be a little bit disharmonious or a lot disharmonious. But you can't be more Socrates or less Socrates. That's at least the idea. Something to think about and object to, perhaps. I'm going to move on. I think the most interesting response to Simmias's objection is the response that I call opposition to its parts. The response is that a harmony on a ukulele cannot be in a state other than out of the elements that make it. If the strings are, the physical strings, are in a certain tension relationship to each other, then the harmony is going to be what it is. If the ukulele is tuned, and I put my fingers this way, I'm going to play G7. I can't play anything but G7. The harmony cannot be in a state other than the elements that make it up. The harmony, G7, does not make up the parts. It follows from the parts. What that means is, if I decide that I want G7 to be here, it can't just be there. The ukulele can't just arrange itself so that G7 is wherever I want it to be. The harmony has to follow the arrangements of the parts. A harmony cannot have any sound or motion which is opposed to the parts. I can't turn G7 into A7 because A7 is opposed to this arrangement. Every harmony depends on the manner in which the parts are arranged. With respect to the soul and the body, though, the soul is sometimes at variance with the body. There are many cases where the body clearly wants one thing, but the soul directs it to something else. Think about food, drink, exercise. Your body may want to sleep in, but your soul directs it to go to class. And so the soul seems to lead the body and not vice versa, whereas the harmony is led by the physical arrangements. And so the soul is not like a harmony. Let's stop here, think a little bit about what you've heard, and we'll return to Socrates' response to Cabes' objection. Socrates' response to Cabes' objection is one of the most difficult parts of the Phaedo. It's difficult because it makes use of some rather abstract and obscure tenets of Plato's views. I don't expect you to get it all at once, and that's why we should talk about it in class. Remember what Cabes' objection was. The fact that things must come to be dead from having been living, or come to be living from having been dead, doesn't imply that the soul is immortal. It may just mean that the soul is different from the body. Maybe the soul is not immortal, it just likes to wear different bodies and then dies. Plato's response is incredibly complicated because it makes use of his theory of the forms. Remember what the forms are. The forms are what everything in a category has in common that makes it a member of that category. What do all triangles have in common? They all have 3 sides and 3 angles that add up to 180 degrees. That characterization is the form of a triangle. What is it that all pious things have in common that make them pious? We don't know because Euthyphro couldn't give a good objection. But whatever it is, that's the form for piety. Plato, in his other works, gives you what his theory of these things are. He tells you, this is what I think the form of justice is. In any case, he makes use of that liberally in the rest of the Phaedo. In order to respond to Cabes' objection, he gives an argument as to why the soul is something that has to be immortal based on the kind of forms that it participates in. And what do I mean by that? Okay, the first thing that you need to know about Plato's account of the forms is that the forms explain why the world looks the way it looks. The forms are the explanation of everything in the world. Everything that's yellow has something in common. What it has in common is it partakes in the form yellow. What makes something just is that it partakes in something in the form just. What makes something equal then is that it partakes in the equal then relationship. So, in the Phaedo, Socrates wants Cabes to understand the following distinction. It's the distinction between the real cause of something and an enabler, or that which enables the cause to be a cause. Suppose I pick up a bottle because I'm thirsty and I take a drink. What's the cause of me picking up the bottle? A good answer is, I was thirsty. My thirst is the cause of me picking up the bottle. But it's also true that it wouldn't be possible for me to have done what I've done without having an arm to pick up the bottle, right? Me being thirsty wouldn't have been enough to get me to pick up the bottle unless I also had an arm. Why did I pick up the bottle? What's the cause? My arm was the cause is not a good answer. My arm didn't cause me to pick up the bottle and take a drink. My being thirsty caused that. But my arm is an enabler of the real cause. It's not itself the cause. So the arm is an enabler of the cause of my action of picking up and drinking water, whereas the real cause is that I was thirsty. Now that we have that distinction, Plato is arguing in the Phaedo, the real cause of things is the forms. What makes yellow things yellow is that they partake in the form yellow. What makes beautiful things beautiful is that they partake in the form beauty. This is contrary to the way we would talk about it. We would say, it's yellow because somebody painted it, or it's yellow because the pigmentation of the flowers comes from this chemical, blah, 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 blah. Plato would say, those are all things like your arm. They enable the form of yellow to go into the flower or the fence. But what really causes it to be yellow is the form yellow. The reason why a certain statue is beautiful is not because of the arrangement of the shape and colors of it. Those things are like your arm, enabling the form, beauty, to be in the statue. Following? Let's finish this argument up. The real cause of things are their forms. And no form shares in its opposite. Some things can have opposite properties at different times. I might have once been short and now I'm tall. Something could have once been blue, but now it's red. That's true. Things can partake in different forms in different times. But the form cannot partake in its own opposite. An elephant that is now big was once small, but bigness as a form can never partake in smallness. Redness can never partake in blueness. All of the forms are independent of their opposites. If something is now red, it is not also now blue, because partaking in the form red precludes its being blue now. The form red precludes the form blue. At this point, Socrates has enough to try to make the argument for the immortality of the soul. Some forms carry along with them other forms, so that whatever has the first form also has the second. Example. The form red always carries around the form colored. Everything red is also colored. The number 3 always carries around the form odd, such that anything which is 3 is also odd. If there are 3 glasses, there are an odd number of glasses. And similarly, the form not equal always carries around the form greater than or less than. So when we look at the soul, Socrates is arguing in the last bit that it's part of the nature of the soul to make a body living. The soul brings with it, carries around the form life. The opposite of the form life is the form death. And we've already argued that no form partakes in its opposite. So life, having never admitting its opposite, can never partake in death. Since the soul has to always carry along the form life in the way that 3 always carries along odd, it follows that the soul is deathless and so is immortal. Now let's have you think about and write about these metaphysical arguments for the immortality of the soul. As a matter of fact, today, even for people who believe in the immortality of the soul, or any life after the death of the body, very few people will accept that it's something you can just prove the way that Socrates tries to prove it. Some things you might believe in, but accept nobody can really prove that. Okay, Plato has tried to prove it. So, in your 10 to 15 minute writing today, choose one of these arguments and explore what Plato might have overlooked in his attempt to prove the immortality of the soul. What did Socrates or Simmias or Cabes accept too quickly, without challenge, without enough scrutiny or criticism? Identify those areas and write a little bit about them. And I'll see you in class.